This morning we come to the end of the series we've been looking at over the book of Nehemiah. And while only a few weeks have passed in our study of this book, a number of years have actually passed in the life of Nehemiah, as he is, they suggest, probably about 70 years old now. Unfortunately, not a lot has changed, and he's still facing the pressures of leadership and life in general. But then I suppose that's the reality for many people, and perhaps an accurate reflection of what life sometimes is. Because as many of you well know, the Christian life is not necessarily one of living happily ever after, at least not yet. It's not all that easy to live a victorious Christian life sometimes. It's not always about gaining victory over a particular problem. Sometimes it's about battling that same problem again and again and again. And that has definitely been Nehemiah's experience. But despite this, he has experienced a number of victories. He's cleaned up the city, he's rebuilt the walls, he's overcome the enemies, unified the nation, and guided the people through their recent spiritual revival. And if ever there was a time when a 70-year-old man might want to rest from the physical and emotional pressures, it would be now. But in his aging years, and perhaps just when you would expect him to walk away from added worry and anxiety, he faces up to even more troubling circumstances. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, because that's in Nehemiah chapter 13, and today we're looking at three chapters, chapters 11, 12 and 13, so I hope you brought your lunch. Not really. But beginning now, we want to look just briefly at chapter 11 and 12, where again we find one of those rather lengthy portions of Scripture that you look at and you think, man, why on earth did God include this part in the Bible? Because in chapter 11 verse 3 through chapter 12 verse 26, there is a really lengthy list of Jewish citizens. And so why is it included, and what on earth is the significance of listing all of these people? Well, in the past weeks we have mentioned the need to repopulate the city of Jerusalem. And most of those who had returned from Babylon lived in the surrounding countryside, where they had land to grow their crops and to raise their livestock. But now that the temple is completed and the city walls have been rebuilt, the streets and the buildings are being cleaned and tidied up, the city officials are now looking for people to come back, to return and to live in Jerusalem. Now, as the governor, Nehemiah could have simply ordered the people to move, but instead the local villagers arrange a bunch of town meetings, and using their traditional method of making decisions, they cast lots. And to the Jewish way of thinking, that reflected for them God's choice. However, it also says something about the level of obedience that these people are continuing to display after the recent revival, because their ongoing concern now is to obey God, even if that meant relocating, to move from the country to the city. And so, as a result of the commitment of these people, about a tenth of them relocate to the city of Jerusalem. And verse 2 says, the people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. Now, what follows in chapter 11, beginning in verse 3, is the names of groups and individuals who relocated, and they're listed according to their assigned responsibilities. For example, in verse 12, listed there are those who carried on the work for the temple. These are the ones who took care of the sacrifices. In verse 13, there are the men of standing, sometimes translated as the valiant warriors. And these are the fellows who defended the city. In verse 16, those who had charge of the outside work of the house of God. This was the group that maintained the temple and looked after the building, the grounds. Verse 17 lists those who were assigned to the temple worship, and especially the choir leader, who it says was the director who led in thanksgiving and prayer. Verse 19, the gatekeepers who kept watch over the city. Verse 22 were those responsible for the services in the house of God. And in verse 24, Ahijah was the king's agent in all the affairs relating to the people. Now, beginning then in verse 25, there is a list of the families that continued living in the surrounding villages. Those from the tribe of Benjamin lived to the south of Jerusalem, and those from the tribe of Judah lived in the south, and those from the tribe of Benjamin lived in the north. And verse 36 says that the Levites lived both in the north and the south because they didn't have any ancestral land. Now, just because these folk didn't move to the city, it didn't mean that they were excluded from rights of citizenship. Their work was just as important to the overall well-being of the nation because they raised the crops and raised the animals that were needed for food, and of course the sacrifices in the temple. And so each family, each group, each individual had a different role, and each role was vital to the whole community. Now, when we move on to chapter 12, there is a listing of what Nehemiah continues. And he goes back about 100 years to the time of Zerubbabel. And he lists there in verses 1 through 9 the priests and the Levites who returned with him. In verse 10 and 11 he lists some priests from the time of Joshua to the present. And then in verse 12 to 26 there's a further list of priests and Levites, and they had returned from Babylon, some with Zerubbabel and some at a later date. Now, admittedly, that all seems pretty boring. And you have to wonder what on earth is all of this in aid of. After all, there are many of these folk that are never ever mentioned again in the scriptures. But perhaps we should remember, and this is especially true for the Jew, that names had meaning and they were held of great significance. But more importantly, every one of these individuals is important to God, just as you are important to God. However, while we might wonder at the importance of these names, I'm pretty sure that at some time in each of our lives, we've probably also wondered to ourselves, am I important? Do I mean anything to anyone? Would it really make a difference if I was here or not? You ever felt like that? I guess we're probably more likely to feel like that when we've been disappointed, or it's perhaps all just gotten too much for us. We're discouraged because of a situation that perhaps has arisen or something that's been said. And so we all wonder if our talents or our skills or our gifts have ever been of benefit to anyone. Or could we ever be of value to anyone ever again? We all wonder if we've ever made a difference to anyone's life. So if I may, could I ask you to remember this? And that is that gifts and talents don't necessarily bring recognition. Now, they may at times bring value into a person's life, but the real truth is that you are valuable simply for who you are as a person. Valuable to God, and perhaps surprisingly to us sometimes, very valuable to those who are around you. Because whatever you do, whether it be great or small, Whether it's noticed by others or it's never been noticed at all, your life is certainly being noticed by God. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10 says, "He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them." And so it doesn't matter if you are serving in a prominent role or you are caring for a partner who is unable to care for themselves anymore. God never overlooks, and neither does he forget, the deeds of anyone when they are done with a loving and a caring heart. And so all of these perhaps seemingly insignificant people had a purpose in life, just as you do. Well, after listing all of those people, the story suddenly changes in verse 27 of chapter 12 to the final part of this project, and that is the dedication of the wall, which is not only a time of thanksgiving, but once again it's a time to unite the people. Now, it's possible that Nehemiah himself was responsible for organising this rather lavish event as he sends out messengers to the surrounding areas, to the Levites and the priests and the musicians and the singers, for them to all gather into Jerusalem so that they can prepare and then to lead the people in worship at this dedication ceremony. Verse 30 says that the priests, the Levites, were to purify themselves, and then the singers and musicians, and the gates and the wall. Now, a part of that purification ceremony included praying and fasting, but also a ceremonial washing, as each of these individuals were immersed in water, very similar to baptism today. And to me, it's hard not to miss the significance or the relationship between that rite of purification back then and baptism today. It's a means by which a person is publicly setting themselves apart or aside to God. And on the screen there's a photo of what the Jews called a mikveh, and that's a ceremonial bath, and that was used for these for this ceremony of purification. And so when that ceremony was complete, the group was divided into two. One group was led by Ezra and included a choir and some of the officials of the city and some priests and some Levites and some of the townspeople. And Nehemiah also led a similar group. And then in verse 31 through 37, it describes the direction that Ezra and his group takes as they proceed along the top of the wall, past the dung gate or the refuse gate, onto the fountain gate and the water gate. And then in verse 38 and 39, the second choir that was led by Nehemiah, they go in the opposite direction, past the broad wall, the fish gate, stopping at the gate of the guard. And you can read all of those in those verses there. And this really must have been quite a sight and a sound as they walk along the top of the wall. They're accompanied by the musicians and the singers, and all of this noise is going on, the sound of rejoicing as they go. As they walked, they would have been reminded of all of the time of back-breaking labour that they'd spent over the last little bit. But this is really the culmination of their work. And as they meet at the temple, the musicians and the singers, they join together to form one giant choir. And then they're joined by the residents of the city, and they make such a joyful sound that verse 43 says, the sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard from afar. So this is one amazing day. This is one very, very special day for the Jewish nation. I wonder if Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab, the enemy, I wonder if they were listening. I wonder if they were looking over the wall and wondering what was going on. For the residents of the city and the surrounding villages, The anxiety that they'd felt over the past few years has now turned to rejoicing. The rebuilding had restored their national pride and sense of respectability. The spiritual revival of the past few months had renewed their enthusiasm and their definite appreciation for God, and it gave them back their self-worth, and they were God's people once again. And because the people are so grateful, the last few verses of chapter 12 indicates that there was a renewed desire to support the priests and the Levites and the musicians and the guards with their offerings. And then in the first few verses of chapter 13, they address the problem of associating with their pagan neighbours. Not only forbidding their children to marry into these pagan families, but now these pagan foreigners were asked to leave. And so this is a real spiritual high point for the people of Israel. However, it's about to turn ugly again. And when you come to verse 4 of chapter 13, you really have to wonder, what on earth has happened? And so let's read it. It says, Elisha the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain. New wine and olive oil were ascribed to the Levites, musicians and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. This is Nehemiah. I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. But sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Now, according to chapter 21, it was in the 20th year of Nehemiah that Nehemiah first hears of the trouble in Jerusalem, and he goes back there. And so this is now taking place about 12 years after his initial contact. Let's carry on in verse 7. Here I learned about the evil thing that Elisha had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. And so it seems that following the dedication of the wall, Nehemiah had returned to Babylon, but later on he requests from Artaxerxes permission to return to Jerusalem, and that permission is given. However, during his absence, the old evil ways had begun to creep back in. The high priest and his family weren't really that concerned about keeping the law. But that wasn't the only thing. In fact, there are 4 definite problems that Nehemiah has to deal with. And the first had to do with fraternising with the enemy, verses 4 through 9. Now, previous to this, the people had promised to keep clear of their pagan heathen neighbours. But it wasn't long before Tobiah was actually given a room in the temple building itself. Now, Tobiah had been a constant source of trouble for Nehemiah in times past, but this was really something else, because the sacred vessels, the grain offerings, the wine offerings, all of those things that were there for worship in the temple were taken out of the temple. And Tobiah's bed and wardrobe and a few other things were brought in, so that he's got this little apartment, this little flat that he can live in when he comes to visit Jerusalem. Now, it would be safe to assume, I think, that the actions of Elisha the high priest would not have been really accepted by everyone. Many of the high priests and Levites and ordinary people still respected Nehemiah and the Old Testament teachings, but as is often happens, they couldn't do much about it. The high priest had all the power, so the people just gave in. But perhaps what they didn't see coming was the consequences of their actions. Because if the storeroom for the tithes and offerings was turned into a guest room for Tobiah, where were the offerings going to be kept? And if there is no place to keep the offerings, well, we won't even bother bringing any offerings. And so if the offerings aren't received, the priests and the Levites begin to go without, and so eventually they have to return to their farms just simply so they can survive. And so when Nehemiah returns, he assesses the problem and he takes action and he throws Tobiah's belongings out into the street and he puts back the temple vessels so that the people could worship again. Now the second issue he addresses is sort of related to that, and it is to do with the giving of tithes and offerings, and we read about that in verses 10 through 14. Verse 10 says, all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. Now, these guys had no more financial support. They needed to be able to provide for themselves, and as a result, these services at the temple, they suffered. And when the services were held, the people were thinking, man, what's the point of participating? If the leadership doesn't think this is important, why should I think it's important? So once again, Nehemiah, he steps back in. He takes the officials to task. He called the priests and the Levites back to carry out their responsibilities, and he encouraged the people once again to bring back their tithes and their offerings. The third problem he needs to deal with was the keeping of the Sabbath, and that's in verses 15 through 23. And Nehemiah is completely disappointed with the total disrespect of the Sabbath laws that these people had agreed to keep. And so instead they're making deliveries and they're setting up their market stall. The men from Tyre on the coast of the Mediterranean were selling their fish, and people were buying and selling, and this was all happening on the day of rest and worship. And so Nehemiah, he confronts the leaders and the traders, and he shuts the city gates, and he orders the Levites to stand guard over the city. Now, do you think that won him many friends? Do you think the traders were happy that they had to wait a whole day outside the city gates? Their fish probably starting to smell a bit. Can you imagine them trying to maybe pick the lock on the city gate, or maybe looking for an overhanging branch over the wall so they can somehow get into the city? But then again, do you think it bothered Nehemiah that they were upset? No, not at all. And verse 21 says, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you. And from that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. And so once again, we can see Nehemiah taking decisive action to right a wrong. And then one last issue, and that is the problem of mixed marriages. As he wanders around the city and the villages, he notices that many of the men had gone back on their promise and had married these women from the pagan nations. Their children couldn't speak and they couldn't understand Hebrew, and there was a real lack of understanding regarding the law, and this had been their downfall on so many occasions. And Nehemiah, once again, is just so disappointed. But he's determined that this won't happen again. And so he reminds them of their past and makes them promise again that these mixed marriages with the pagan nations would not be allowed. And with that, and I guess kind of abruptly, Nehemiah closes his book with just a few final words in verse 31. This very courageous, very organised, deeply spiritual man of God, this man who was once a wine taster but now become a builder of walls, simply says in the last verse, remember me with favour, my God. Which maybe is another way of saying, Lord, I want to live my life so that when you think of me, you'll have good thoughts. When you notice what I did, and when you remember the choices that I made and the way that I lived my life, you'll be pleased with me. Now, this entire book that we've spent the last 8 weeks looking at is about more than just building a wall. It's about giving the people hope and direction. It's about more than a people's just simple spiritual renewal. It's about shaping their future. And without question, it's the story of a godly man who took his leadership role very seriously. He faced the opposition from outside and within. And he should be remembered for his courage, his determination, and his willingness to face the difficult issues and to do something about them if they were even unpopular choices. And so as we come to the end of the book, and whether you are in a role of leadership, wherever it might be, or perhaps you're not, there are a few just simple last-minute observations that we can learn from Nehemiah. And the first is that he is committed to the truth. And the truth in any situation helped him to see what was right and what was wrong, and that helped him to make the right choice. And as a result of making the right choice, he could take the correct action. Secondly, he considered every issue very carefully. And while the issues that he faced were really quite major issues, and the ones that we face are perhaps sometimes only minor issues, nevertheless, the same principle applies. And Nehemiah couldn't solve a problem until he understood the problem. And that meant that he had to consider every aspect, both sides of the coin, before taking any action. Thirdly, Nehemiah was a man of fearless determination, and that was founded upon some very, very firm convictions that he had. For him, the ways of God were always true and correct, and nothing would stand in the way of that. And the brief history of Israel that he presented in chapter 9 showed that when the people followed God's ways, as a nation they prospered. And when they didn't, they struggled. And then last and most important, Nehemiah maintained a relationship with God which strengthened his convictions. All throughout this book we find Nehemiah praying to God. His prayers are mentioned on, I think, about 10 occasions in the 13 chapters. And whether it's before making a decision or taking action, we find that Nehemiah is praying. And perhaps that's one of the most notable features about his life. Continually under pressure, struggling against evil, facing discouragement and criticism, but all the while motivating the people and creating a vision for a thriving nation and a great city. And through all of this, he's continually aware of the presence of God in his life as he does what he believes God wanted him to do. Now sure, he probably had some weaknesses, just like each of us. But we can learn from the faith and the passion of a man who was truly a servant of God. So this series has been about more than just the story of Nehemiah's life. In many respects, it's a practical demonstration of how we should live our lives as well. And so I trust that over the last few weeks you've picked up on some of the themes and learned some things that we can apply to our life as we live for Christ. Let's pray. Father, this story brings for us at this moment a close to the story of Nehemiah's life. But Father, we thank you for the many lessons that we have learned over the past few weeks. We've seen his faithfulness despite the difficulties that he's been through. Father, the way that he helped and encouraged the people, the way that he led them. Father, his decisiveness in decisions that needed to be made. Father, his prayer life. His willingness to actively follow the law of the Old Testament that was so relevant for him. And so, Father, we thank you that he has demonstrated to us of just how we can live our life as well. Thank you for those lessons. May we apply them to our lives as we endeavour to live for you. And this we ask in Jesus' name.